Arrogant man refuses to get up from elderly woman's seat, but she's the pilot's mother. Richard Bennett was climbing the airplane stairs with that posture he'd cultivated for years. The dark blue suit was impeccable, his hair slicked back with imported gel, and on his face that expression of someone who had no time to waste with ordinary people. He walked right past the flight attendant, smiling at the entrance, didn't even look at her properly. His hands held a cell phone to his ear, while he spoke too loudly about numbers and contracts. Other passengers moved away from the aisle to let him pass, and he didn't even notice. Or he noticed and simply didn't care. "No, I already told you I need that report before landing in Chicago," he practically shouted into the phone. "I don't care if it's the weekend. Do you think clients care about that?" It was when he reached first class and saw the scene that made him stop. An elderly woman with grey hair was sitting exactly in the seat printed on his boarding pass. Seat 2A, his seat. She wore a simple beige blouse and had a small bag on her lap. She looked calm, gazing out the window, with that serene expression of someone in no hurry at all. Richard looked at the boarding pass, then at the woman, then at the pass again. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. Not on such an important day like this one. "Excuse me," he said, his voice already loaded with impatience. "I think there's a mistake. This is my seat." The woman turned her face slowly. She had tired brown eyes, deep wrinkles around her mouth, hands that trembled slightly. She must have been about 65, maybe 70 years old. She looked at Richard with a calmness that irritated him even more. "Hello, son," she said in a soft voice. "I believe you're mistaken. This seat here is mine. See, it's on my ticket." She held up a slightly crumpled paper. Richard didn't even look properly. "Don't call me son. I'm not your son, thank God," he replied, feeling the blood rise. "And this seat is mine. I paid for it. First class. You must have gotten confused. Economy class is back there." Some passengers who were boarding began to notice the argument. A young woman with headphones stopped in the aisle. A middle-aged man adjusted his glasses to see better. Richard didn't care. He was right. And that was that. "But my son," the woman started again, trying to show the paper. "It clearly says here that seat 2A is—" "I already said I'm not your son." Richard raised his voice. "And I won't waste any more time with this. Get up now and go to your real seat before I call someone." The flight attendant who had greeted him at the entrance appeared quickly, sensing the tension in the air. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with a well-pressed uniform and a professional smile on her face. But the smile wavered when she saw the situation. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, looking between Richard and the woman. "Yes, there's a problem," Richard shot back before anyone could respond. "This woman is in my seat and refuses to move. I have a crucial meeting in Chicago and don't have time for these games." The flight attendant looked at the woman, who remained seated, her hands now trembling a bit more over her bag. There was something in her eyes, an ancient sadness, but also a dignity that wouldn't bend. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass, please?" the flight attendant asked gently. The elderly woman carefully handed over the paper. The flight attendant examined it, compared it with something on her tablet, and a confused expression crossed her face. "Sir," she turned to Richard, "could you show me your pass too?" Richard pulled the paper from his suit's inner pocket and practically threw it into the girl's hand. He crossed his arms, already knowing he was right. He always was. He had paid double to guarantee that seat. First-class window seat, front row. Perfect for working during the flight. The flight attendant looked between the two tickets, then checked something else on her tablet. Her forehead wrinkled slightly. "Mr. Bennett," she began, choosing her words carefully, "it appears there's been an issue with the reservations. Both cards show seat 2A, but—" "But nothing," Richard interrupted. "I booked first, I paid more, and frankly, look at her and look at me. Who do you think should be in first class?" A heavy silence fell over the cabin. The young woman with headphones took them off completely, eyes wide. The man with glasses shook his head in disapproval. More passengers were piling up in the aisle, unable to pass because of the argument. The elderly woman closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. When she opened them again, tears were beginning to form in the corners, but she blinked quickly to hold them back. "Miss," she said to the flight attendant, her voice still calm despite everything. "If there's truly a problem with the reservation, I can take another seat. I don't want to cause any trouble." "No, ma'am, wait," the flight attendant began, but Richard cut her off again. "Finally, someone with common sense," he said, already moving to take the seat. "Come on, get up. You're holding everyone up." The elderly woman began to rise, using the seat back for support. Her legs seemed weak, and it took her 2 attempts before she was fully standing. Her small purse nearly fell, but she clutched it tightly. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Richard was already settling into the seat, adjusting the cushion, when the flight attendant gently touched the elderly woman's arm. "Ma'am, you don't have to go far. We have another seat here in first class on the aisle. 3C is available." "She can sit anywhere as long as it's not my seat," Richard muttered, already opening his laptop. The elderly woman nodded silently and began to walk down the narrow aisle. Her steps were slow, careful. One hand held her purse, the other tried to steady herself on the seat backs. Richard didn't even look up as she passed by, but as she walked, something fell from her purse. An old photograph, the kind that yellows with time. The young woman with headphones quickly bent down to pick it up. "Ma'am, you dropped this," she said, handing over the photo. The elderly woman looked at the image, and a sad smile crossed her face. In the photo there was a little boy, maybe about 5 years old, wearing a toy pilot's cap. Next to him, a younger woman, who was clearly the same person, now aged. "Thank you, dear," she said softly, carefully putting the photo away. Richard, in the window seat, was completely absorbed in his laptop. He had numbers to review, presentations to prepare. In a few hours, he would be facing investors who could completely change the course of his company. Nothing else mattered. Certainly not some unknown elderly woman and her cheap sentimentality. The flight attendant helped the elderly woman settle into seat 3C. She brought an extra blanket without being asked, and a glass of water. "If you need anything, just call me," she said, but there was something in her eyes as if she wanted to say more. "You're very kind," the elderly woman replied. "What's your name?" "Emily, ma'am." "Emily. That's a beautiful name. It reminds me of my granddaughter." Emily smiled but was called by another passenger and had to move away. The elderly woman settled into the aisle seat, pulled the blanket over her legs, and closed her eyes. Her hands were still trembling slightly. In seat 2A, Richard was typing furiously on his keyboard. He had ordered a whiskey even before the plane took off and was already on his second glass. The amber liquid calmed him a bit, sharpened his mind for numbers, or at least that's what he told himself. The captain made the usual announcement. "Welcome to the flight. Estimated duration. Expected weather in Chicago." Richard barely listened. He was busy rewriting an entire section of his presentation because some idiot at the office had used the wrong charts. The plane began to taxi. The young woman with headphones, seated a few rows back, was still looking at Richard with a disapproving expression. She had discreetly taken out her phone and recorded part of the earlier argument. She wasn't sure what she'd do with it, but something told her it might be important. The takeoff was smooth. The plane climbed through the clouds, and Chicago was left behind below. Richard didn't even glance out the window. He ordered another whiskey as soon as the seatbelt sign went off. The woman in seat 3C opened her eyes and looked around the cabin. There were few people in first class on that flight. Besides her and Richard, there was a middle-aged couple speaking softly and an older man already asleep with an eye mask. It was a quiet mid-week flight, not very full. Emily, the flight attendant, came by offering drinks and snacks. Richard took more whiskey and dismissed the food with an impatient gesture. The woman asked only for an orange juice. "Are you visiting someone in Chicago?" Emily asked as she served. The woman hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'm going to see my son," she said simply. "That's nice. I'm sure he'll be happy to see you." "I hope so. It's been a while." Emily smiled and moved on. There was something in the way the woman spoke, a depth that hinted at untold stories. But flight attendants learned not to ask too many questions. Half an hour after takeoff, one of the other flight attendants, an older woman named Diane, passed through first class doing her routine checks. She glanced at the woman in seat 3C, then looked again, more closely this time. Her eyes widened slightly. She bent down beside the woman's seat, lowering her voice. "Mrs. Margaret," she whispered. "Is that you?" The woman looked up, and a small smile appeared on her tired face. "Diane, it's been so long. My God, it really is you. I thought... But here in first class I didn't expect..." Diane seemed genuinely surprised and confused. "But what are you doing here? I thought..." Margaret made a discreet gesture with her hand, indicating they shouldn't draw attention. Diane understood immediately and nodded. She squeezed Margaret's hand quickly. "If you need anything at all, let me know," Diane said quietly. "Thank you, dear. I'm fine." Diane moved away but shot a penetrating look at Richard in seat 2A before disappearing into the plane's galley. Emily noticed the interaction and approached her colleague as soon as they were alone. "What was that?" Emily asked. "Do you know that woman?" Diane looked back, making sure no one was listening. "I do," she said slowly. "Or rather, I know her by sight. Emily, that woman is not who that rude man thinks she is." "What do you mean?" "I can't say much, it's not my place, but I'll tell you one thing, he's going to regret how he treated her." Emily wanted to ask more, but another passenger called for assistance. She saved her curiosity for later. In seat 2A, Richard finally closed his laptop and leaned back, feeling the effects of the whiskey. His eyes were getting heavy. He hadn't slept well the last 3 nights, obsessively preparing for this meeting. Maybe he could take a quick nap. That's when he heard it. A low, rhythmic sound. Someone was tapping their fingers somewhere nearby. He opened his eyes and looked around. The woman in seat 3C had her hands in her lap, but one of them was lightly drumming on the armrest. Richard rolled his eyes. Of course she would make noise. Old people had no awareness of these things. "Hey," he called out, turning in his seat. "You there? Can you stop that noise? I'm trying to work here." Margaret looked at him, only now realizing she had been drumming. It was an old habit, something she did when she was nervous. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't notice." "Yeah, you didn't notice," Richard huffed. "Just like you didn't notice you were in the wrong seat earlier." Margaret didn't respond. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, preventing them from moving. But the silence seemed to bother Richard even more than the noise. He turned back to the window and closed his eyes again. But now he was too irritated to sleep. Why couldn't people just leave him alone? Why did there always have to be some inconvenience, some minor annoyance to ruin everything? His thoughts drifted, as always happened when he was alone and quiet. He thought about the meeting waiting for him in Chicago. He thought about what he would say, how he would impress the investors. He thought about the empty apartment waiting for him afterward, the cold white walls, the refrigerator with only frozen food and beer. He thought, for a brief moment, about his own mother. She had called last week, or had it been 2 weeks ago? He hadn't answered. He never answered. She always wanted to talk about unimportant things, how he was doing, if he was eating well, if he had met anyone special. Annoying questions that led nowhere. Richard shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. He didn't have time for sentimentality. He had gotten where he was by being tough, by being focused. He couldn't afford to be soft like his father had been. The flight continued smoothly. The clouds outside were white and soft like cotton. Inside the cabin, the temperature was pleasant, the air conditioning working perfectly. That's when the plane began to shake. It was light at first, just a small jolt, like hitting a pothole in the road. Richard opened his eyes. The couple a few rows back stopped talking. The older man with the eye mask kept sleeping. Another jolt, this one stronger. The plane shook sideways, and some cups on the trays slid. Margaret held tightly to the armrests. The fastened seatbelt light came on with a beep. The captain's voice came over the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking. We are passing through an area of turbulence. Please return to your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened. Our flight attendants, please also secure yourselves for safety." Emily and Diane quickly checked if everyone had their seatbelts on, then sat in their own special seats near the galley. Emily looked through the curtain gap, trying to see if the economy class passengers were okay. The turbulence increased. The plane shook more forcefully now, moving up and down in irregular motions. Some passengers began to look worried. The couple held hands. The older man woke up and removed his mask, looking around confused. Richard tightened his seatbelt, but he wasn't really scared. He flew often. Turbulence was normal. Annoying, but normal. He looked back at his laptop, trying to continue working despite the jolts. But then the plane dropped. It was a sudden drop, as if the floor had disappeared beneath them. Everyone's stomachs rose to their throats. Screams echoed through the cabin. Cups and unsecured objects flew through the air. Richard's laptop slipped from his lap and hit the floor. The plane recovered, stabilizing once again, but the scare had been real. There was a tense silence now, punctuated only by the heavy breathing of the people and the steady sounds of the engines. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice returned, and there was a tension in it that wasn't there before. "We are adjusting our altitude to exit this area of turbulence. Please remain calm and stay seated. We will get through this shortly." But the turbulence didn't improve. If anything, it got worse. The plane was shaking constantly now, going up and down, swaying side to side. The oxygen masks rattled in their compartments overhead, but they didn't drop. Not yet. Richard felt, for the first time in a long time, something like fear. His hands gripped the armrests tightly. He looked out the window and saw the dark clouds now, dense and threatening. He looked across the aisle and saw Margaret. The lady was sitting quietly, her eyes closed, her hands clasped in her lap. Her lips were moving slightly, as if she was praying or murmuring something to herself. But there was no panic on her face. There was a strange calm and acceptance. This irritated Richard even more. Why was she so calm? Couldn't she see what was happening? The plane was clearly in danger. "Hey!" he shouted to her over the noise of the engines and the turbulence. "Aren't you worried, or are you too old to understand what's going on?" Margaret opened her eyes slowly and looked at him. There was no anger in her gaze, just a deep sadness. "I am worried, yes," she said calmly. "But worrying won't change anything, so I pray and trust in the one who is flying the plane." "Trust?" Richard let out a humorless laugh. "Trust isn't going to save us if this plane crashes." "Perhaps not," Margaret replied. "But it's all we have sometimes, isn't it? Trust and hope." Richard was about to say something sarcastic, but another strong drop of the plane made him shut his mouth quickly. His stomach churned, and for a moment he thought he would vomit. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to breathe deeply. It was 15 terrible minutes, 15 minutes that felt like hours. The turbulence eventually began to subside, the jolts becoming less frequent and less intense. The plane stabilized, and the fasten seatbelt light finally went off. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, and there was audible relief in his voice, "we have now exited the area of turbulence. You may relax now. I apologize for the scare. We will continue to Chicago without further incident, we hope." A collective sigh of relief echoed through the cabin. Emily and Diane quickly stood up, checking if everyone was okay, if anyone was injured. Miraculously, everyone was in one piece. Scared, for sure, but in one piece. Richard slowly released the armrests. His hands were white from gripping so hard. He looked at them, somewhat ashamed of having been so shaken. He was Richard Bennett. He didn't get scared by things like turbulence. But his heart was still beating fast. Emily passed by, picking up items that had fallen during the turbulence. She picked up Richard's laptop from the floor and handed it to him. "Here you go, sir. I hope it's not broken." Richard took the laptop without thanking her. He opened the screen and saw with relief that it still worked. Everything was fine. He could get back to work, return to normal. But when he looked at the screen, the words seemed blurry. He blinked, trying to focus, but something was wrong. It took him a moment to realize his hands were trembling. He snapped the laptop shut and pushed it aside. He asked for another whiskey. Emily hesitated for a second, but brought it. Richard drank half the glass in one go. The journey continued. The turbulence had passed, but it left a heavy mood in the cabin. People were quieter now, more thoughtful. Even the couple that had been talking earlier was now silent, just holding hands. Diane approached Margaret again, this time with a cup of hot tea. "I thought you might want this," she said gently. "Thank you, Diane. That's very kind of you. How are you feeling? That turbulence was frightening." "I'm all right," Margaret smiled weakly. "I've been through worse." Diane nodded. She wanted to say more, wanted to ask more, but knew it wasn't the moment. Instead, she just gave Margaret's shoulder a quick squeeze and moved on. Richard observed the interaction out of the corner of his eye. There was something strange about how that flight attendant treated the woman. More than just professional courtesy. There was respect there, perhaps even reverence. He shook his head. He was imagining things. The whiskey and the scare from the turbulence were messing with his head. The rest of the flight was smooth. No more turbulence, no more incidents. Richard eventually managed to open his laptop again and get some work done, though he couldn't concentrate as well as before. His eyes kept drifting to the window, watching the clouds that were now white and peaceful again. Margaret remained quiet in her seat. She looked out the window a few times, but mostly kept her eyes closed. She didn't seem to be sleeping, just thinking, remembering. Emily noticed that throughout the entire rest of the flight, Margaret kept touching that photo that had fallen earlier. The photo of the boy with the pilot's cap. She held it between her fingers, running her thumb over the faded image. 1 hour before landing, the head flight attendant, a woman around 50 named Barbara, came to make her usual announcement. She had that clear, professional voice, well trained over decades of flying. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will soon begin our descent into Chicago. Please return to your seats and—" She stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes had landed on Margaret, sitting in seat 3C. Barbara blinked, surprised, and then a huge smile lit up her face. "Mrs. Margaret," she exclaimed, completely forgetting protocol. "You're here, I didn't know." She practically rushed to Margaret's side, bending down to be at eye level with the woman. "How are you? It's been so long." Barbara took Margaret's hands in hers. "If I had known you were on this flight—" "It's all right, Barbara," Margaret said softly. "It's just a flight like any other." "But, ma'am, you should have let us know. I would have prepared—" No, Margaret gently interrupted. "I don't want special treatment. I'm just visiting like anyone else." Barbara seemed about to protest, but then saw the expression on Margaret's face and understood. She nodded slowly. "I understand," she said quietly, "but if you need anything—" "I know where to find you," Margaret finished with a small smile. Richard was watching all this with growing irritation and confusion. First the other flight attendant, Diane, treating that old woman like she was someone important. Now the head flight attendant doing the same thing. What was going on? Who was that woman, he wanted to ask. But his pride stopped him. He wouldn't show curiosity. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Barbara eventually moved away, but not before whispering something in Margaret's ear that Richard couldn't hear. Margaret nodded in response, and Barbara squeezed her hand one more time before returning to her duties. The descent began. The plane tilted gently, starting the long process of coming down from the skies to the earth. Richard looked out the window and saw Chicago down below, growing from tiny dots into distinguishable buildings. He should have been excited. The meeting was close, his chance to shine, to prove his worth. But for some reason all he felt was an empty feeling in his stomach. Maybe it was the turbulence, or maybe it was the whiskey, or maybe it was something else entirely. The plane landed smoothly on the runway. The wheels touched down with a slight jolt, and then they were on the ground, slowing rapidly. Applause echoed through the cabin, a Brazilian tradition that Richard always found ridiculous. He didn't clap. When the plane stopped at the gate and the seatbelt sign went off, there was the usual rush of people standing up, grabbing luggage, eager to get out. Richard was one of the first to stand, opening the overhead compartment and pulling out his expensive leather briefcase. He didn't even look at Margaret as he prepared to leave. He just wanted to get off that plane, leave that strange and uncomfortable trip behind. He had a meeting to get to, after all. The plane door opened and passengers began filing out. Richard was among the first, pushing past some people who were taking too long. He was in a hurry. He was always in a hurry. But when he reached the door, where Emily and the other flight attendants were saying goodbye to the passengers, something made him stop for a brief second. He looked back. Margaret was still seated. She wasn't in a hurry. She was letting everyone else go first, as if she had all the time in the world. Emily was beside her, helping her with her small bag. For a moment, just a moment, Richard thought about going back. Thought about, what? Apologizing? Why? He hadn't done anything wrong. He had just defended his right to the seat he paid for. He shook his head and moved on, stepping off the plane and into the jet bridge. But as he walked through the airport corridor, his briefcase bumping against his leg, Richard couldn't get the image of that lady out of his head. The sad eyes, the calm during the turbulence, the way the flight attendants treated her. There was something there, something he was missing, but he didn't have time to think about it now. He had a meeting. He had business. Richard quickened his pace, leaving the gate and those troubling thoughts behind, or at least trying to. What Richard didn't know, what he couldn't know as he hurried away through the busy O'Hare International Airport, was that this flight wouldn't end at the plane door. The consequences of his actions, of his words, were already in motion. And soon, very soon, he would find out exactly who Margaret was, and he would discover that some people in life deserve respect not for their money or position, but simply for who they are, for their stories, for their worth as human beings. But that revelation was yet to come. For now, Richard Bennett walked confidently through the airport, believing he had won another small battle in his life of achievements and successes. He had no idea how wrong he was. The story was just beginning. Richard quickly passed the baggage carousel, grabbed his large carry-on without stopping to check for any damage, and headed straight for the exit. He had booked an executive car to pick him up, and the driver was probably already waiting. Meanwhile, back on the plane, Margaret finally stood up. Her legs were a bit numb from sitting for so long, and she had to hold onto the seat back to steady herself. Emily was there instantly, offering her arm for support. "Take your time, ma'am," she said gently. "There's no rush." "Thank you, dear," Margaret smiled. "You're very thoughtful. Ma'am, forgive my curiosity, but you seem to know a lot of the crew. Do you fly often?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I used to fly more. Not so much now, but yes, I know several people who work for this airline." There was something unspoken in those words, something deeper. Emily sensed it, but didn't press further. Instead, she just helped Margaret walk down the airplane aisle toward the exit. When they reached the door, Barbara, the head flight attendant, was waiting there. Beside her stood a tall man in uniform, a pilot. Not the flight's pilot, but someone who had apparently been waiting at the gate. "Mrs. Wilson," the pilot said, removing his cap in a gesture of respect. "It's good to see you, Captain Jonathan, ma'am. My father served with your husband. He always talks about how much he learned during those years." Margaret smiled, a smile filled with memories. "Your father was excellent, one of the best. How is he doing?" "Very well, ma'am. Retired and happy. He always says it was thanks to the commander's teachings that he became the pilot he was." Emily was growing more and more confused. "Commander? What commander?" But before she could ask, Barbara gently touched her arm and shook her head, indicating it wasn't the time. Margaret talked for a few more minutes with Captain Jonathan, asking about his family, about how things were going in aviation. There was a genuine familiarity there, the kind of connection that only years of shared history can create. Finally, Margaret said goodbye and began walking down the jet bridge, still slowly, still carefully holding her small purse. Emily accompanied her as far as she could, up to the limit of her work area. "It was a pleasure having you on the flight, ma'am," Emily said sincerely. "The pleasure was mine, dear. You have a kind heart. Don't lose that, no matter what happens in life." Emily felt her eyes grow moist without quite knowing why. There was something about that lady, something special she couldn't define. Margaret continued alone through the airport corridor, passing closed shops and empty chairs. It was mid-afternoon on a Thursday, and the airport was relatively quiet. Her footsteps echoed softly on the marble floor. Meanwhile, Richard was already in the executive car, in the back seat, reviewing his notes one last time. The driver drove in silence, navigating through Chicago's heavy traffic. The meeting would be at a hotel in the Gold Coast, just 40 minutes away if there was no traffic jam. But there was, there always was. Richard drummed his fingers impatiently on his knee as he looked at the cars stopped in front of him. His phone rang. It was Michael, his partner. "Richard, where are you?" Michael's voice sounded tense. "In traffic. I just left the airport. I'll be there in half an hour." Half an hour might be too late. The investors are getting impatient. They arrived 15 minutes ago. "Tell them my flight had severe turbulence. Blame the airline. Say whatever you need to. Just buy me some time." "All right, but hurry." Richard hung up and looked out the window again. The traffic wasn't moving. He could feel the tension rising in his shoulders, the familiar pressure tightening his temples. He needed that meeting. He needed the investors. His company was at a critical point, and without that money, he didn't want to think about what would happen without that money. The phone rang again. This time it was an unknown number. Richard usually didn't answer unknown numbers, but he was nervous, distracted. He answered. "Hello." "Mr. Bennett?" It was a young woman's voice. "My name is Heather. I'm a journalist with Chicago Today. I'd like to ask you a few questions about the incident on today's flight." Richard froze. "Incident? What incident?" "You don't know? There's a video of you circulating on social media from the flight you just took. It shows you arguing with an elderly lady, forcing her to leave her seat." Richard's blood ran cold. "How did you get my number?" "That doesn't matter. Would you like to comment on the video? It already has over 50,000 views and is growing quickly." "I have nothing to say. Don't call me again." He hung up with trembling hands. "Video? What video?" Who had filmed it? With nervous fingers, he opened the social media app on his phone. He typed his name. And there it was. The video had been posted 2 hours ago by an account called Justice Seeker 89. The description read, "Arrogant executive humiliates elderly lady on flight, forcing her out of her first-class seat. Is this the America we want?" Richard pressed play with his heart hammering. The quality wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. There he was, yelling at Margaret, saying she was in the wrong seat, calling security, uttering those terrible words that now came back to haunt him. "Look at her and look at me. Who do you think should be in first class?" The comments were in the hundreds, thousands, and they all said the same thing. He was despicable, disgusting, an example of everything wrong with wealthy people. They called for a boycott of his company. They demanded he be sued. Richard felt panic rising. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when he was so close to closing that crucial deal. He called Michael again. "Michael, we have a problem." "I know, I just saw it. Richard, what were you thinking?" "I didn't do anything wrong. She was in my seat." "That doesn't matter now. The video is everywhere. The company is being tagged. People are—" The call was interrupted by another incoming call. It was his lawyer. "Richard, have you seen it?" "I have. What do we do?" "We need damage control. Immediately. You have to make a public statement, apologize, show that—" "Apologize? For what? I didn't do anything wrong." "Richard, you publicly humiliated an elderly lady. It doesn't matter if you were technically right about the seat. Perception is everything, and the perception now is that you're an arrogant bully." Richard hung up. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't believe it. He was the victim here, a victim of an outrage culture, of people who didn't understand how the real world worked. But deep down, very deep down, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had gone too far. He tried to push the voice away. The car finally started moving. The traffic was clearing up. Richard looked at his watch. He would still make it to the meeting. He just needed to focus. Forget the video, forget the lady, forget everything, and focus on what mattered. Business, money, success. 20 minutes later, the car stopped in front of the hotel. Richard got out quickly, straightened his suit, took a deep breath. He could do this. He was good at it. Presentations, persuasion, making deals. Nothing else mattered. He entered the hotel lobby, a luxurious space with marble and crystal chandeliers. Michael was waiting near the elevators, looking nervous. Beside him was a woman Richard didn't know, in a dark pantsuit and a serious expression. "Richard," Michael said as he approached, "this is Dr. Jennifer Parker, our public relations consultant. She needs to speak with you before the meeting." "I don't have time for this now. The investors are waiting." "The investors can wait another 5 minutes," Jennifer said firmly. "Mr. Bennett, we need to discuss the social media situation. It's escalating rapidly and needs to be contained." "After the meeting." "Mr. Bennett, this video isn't just an image problem. It's directly affecting business. We've already had 3 clients contact us, questioning whether they want to remain associated with someone with your attitude." Richard stopped. 3 clients? That was serious. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. 5 minutes. But that's it." They moved to a more secluded corner of the lobby. Jennifer pulled out a tablet and showed him the numbers. The video was spreading exponentially. It wasn't just on American social media anymore. It was being shared internationally, with captions in English and Spanish. "Brazilian executive bullies elderly woman on plane," was the headline on several international websites. "We need to make a public statement immediately," Jennifer said. "A sincere apology, a donation to some cause related to the elderly, maybe volunteer work. Something that shows you've learned, that you've changed. I won't humiliate myself publicly over this." "Then you'll lose much more than your dignity," Jennifer said coldly. "You'll lose your clients, your investors, possibly your company. Is that what you want?" Richard clenched his jaw. He wanted to scream that it was all unfair, that he didn't deserve to be judged for a moment, for a silly argument about an airplane seat. But looking at the numbers on the tablet, at the seriousness on Jennifer's face, he knew he had no choice. "I'll think about it after the meeting." "There is no after, Mr. Bennett. There is only now." But Richard was already walking toward the elevators. Michael sighed and followed him, throwing an apologetic look at Jennifer. The meeting room was on the 10th floor. It was a spacious and modern space with a long dark wood table and leather chairs. Huge windows overlooked the city of Chicago, the buildings stretching as far as the eye could see. 3 men were waiting in the room. The investors. Richard knew them from photos and research. Donald Harrison, a 62-year-old veteran businessman, Jason Miller, younger, perhaps 40, a technology expert, and Howard Stevens, the main one, the one who really mattered, a 55-year-old man who controlled a $500 million investment fund. Richard entered with his most confident smile. "Gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. Severe turbulence on the flight." Howard Stevens didn't smile back. In fact, none of them smiled. "Mr. Bennett," Howard said, his voice cold, "sit down." Something was wrong. Richard could feel it. The atmosphere in the room was icy, even hostile. But he sat down, opened his laptop, prepared to start the presentation. "Before we begin," Howard interrupted before Richard could say anything, "we need to discuss something. We saw a video today, a video of you, on the plane." Richard's stomach sank. "That has nothing to do with business." "It has everything to do with it," Donald Harrison interjected. "We don't just invest in companies, Mr. Bennett. We invest in people, in character. And what we saw in that video wasn't the character of someone we want to invest our money in." "It was a misunderstanding," Richard began, but Jason Miller cut him off. "A misunderstanding? You publicly humiliated an elderly lady, forced her out of her seat, spoke to her in a way that, frankly, disgusted me. She was in my seat." "And that justifies treating her that way?" Howard asked. "Mr. Bennett, we have values, principles, and they don't align with what we saw in that video. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing." "Gentlemen, please," Michael tried to intervene. "Richard has already acknowledged he could have handled the situation better. He's going to make a public statement, he's going to apologize, but that shouldn't affect our business partnership." "It should and it does," Howard said firmly. "We're out." The words fell like a bomb in the room. You can't," Richard stammered. "We have an almost closed deal, months of negotiations. You saw the numbers, you saw the potential." "And we also saw who you really are," Donald said, standing up. "Sorry, Mr. Bennett, But there's no amount of money in the world that would make us want to be associated with someone like you." The three investors stood up, picked up their briefcases, and left the room without looking back. Richard Bennett sat there frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Michael sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "It's over," he said quietly. "Without that investment, the company will go bankrupt in 6 months, maybe less." Richard didn't answer. He was looking at the view from the window at the Chicago skyline, but he wasn't really seeing anything. His mind was blank, a shocked void. Years of work, years of building that company from scratch, and everything destroyed in an instant because of what? A seat? An argument with an elderly lady? It seemed absurd. It seemed unfair, but it was real. His phone rang again. More calls, more questions, more accusations. He turned the device off completely and threw it on the table. "What do I do now?" he asked, more to himself than to Michael. "I don't know," Michael admitted. "Honestly, I don't know." They sat there for long minutes in silence. Then Michael slowly stood up. "I'm going back to the office, try to do damage control, talk to the clients we still have, see if I can save anything." Michael: "No, Richard. I don't want to hear apologies. I don't want to hear justifications. You ruined everything. You ruined years of work for both of us because of your ego." Michael left, leaving Richard alone in the empty conference room. Richard sat there for a long time. He didn't know how long. An hour? 2? The sun moved outside, the shadows of the buildings shifting on the ground. Eventually he stood up. He picked up his laptop, his briefcase, his dead phone. He walked to the elevators like an automaton. In the hotel lobby, life went on as normal. People laughing, talking, checking in and out. No one recognized him. No one knew about the video, or if they did, they didn't show it. Richard left the hotel and stood on the sidewalk. He no longer had the executive car. He had dismissed the driver as soon as he arrived. He would have to call a ride. But where to go? To the hotel where he had booked a room? To the airport, to catch the first flight back? Where? He started walking. No direction, just walking. The streets of Chicago stretched out around him, full of cars and hurried people. Everyone had somewhere to go, something important to do. Except him. His legs carried him without him thinking much, corner after corner, block after block. He passed expensive restaurants where he had once had business lunches. He passed designer stores where he bought his suits. He passed everything that represented his success, his life before that day. He didn't realize where he was going until he was there. The airport. O'Hare International Airport was right in front of him, lit up against the darkening sky. Without thinking much, Richard entered. The terminal was busier now, the evening rush hour. Families returning from trips, executives heading to meetings, couples holding hands, everyone with their destinations, their lives. Richard wandered through the airport, passing shops and restaurants. He should have been hungry since he hadn't eaten anything since the snack on the plane, but he felt nothing, just emptiness. That's when he saw her. Margaret. She was sitting in one of the chairs near a gate, the same small bag on her lap. But now there was someone with her, a man in a uniform, a pilot. Richard stopped in the middle of the corridor, people passing him on both sides. He watched from a distance. Margaret was smiling now, talking animatedly with the pilot. The man was about 45, maybe 50, with hair starting to go grey. He was holding Margaret's hand as they spoke, a clear and affectionate connection between them. Richard should have left, should have let it go. But something pulled him closer. Curiosity? Guilt? He didn't know. He moved close enough to hear fragments of the conversation. "It's been so long, Mom," the pilot was saying. "You should come more often, or let me come to you." Mum. So the pilot was her son. Richard vaguely remembered Margaret mentioning she was going to visit her son. "You know how it is, son," Margaret would reply. "I don't like to bother. You have your life, your work. You're never a bother. Never." It was then that the pilot looked up and saw Richard standing there watching. His eyes narrowed, recognizing him immediately. "You," he said, his voice suddenly cold. "You're the man from the flight." Margaret turned and saw Richard. Her expression grew sad but not angry. Just sad. William, she said softly to her son. It's all right. No, it's not all right. William stood up, and Richard realized he was tall, imposing in his pilot's uniform. I saw the video. I saw how you treated my mother. Do you have any idea who she is? Richard couldn't speak. His throat was tight. William, please. Margaret tried to calm her son, but he was too upset. No, Mom. He needs to know. He needs to know that the woman he humiliated, that he forced out of her seat, that he treated as if she were nothing, is Margaret Wilson, widow of Captain Robert Wilson, one of the most decorated pilots in the history of American aviation. The woman who raised 3 children alone after my father passed. The woman who worked as a nurse for 50 years helping people. The woman who... William, that's enough, Margaret said more firmly. He doesn't need to know any of that. But William didn't stop. She's one of the founders of the Aviation Families Support Association. She has helped hundreds of families over the years. When he passed in an accident 15 years ago, she took the compensation and created a fund to help other families who went through the same. She never used a penny for herself. Richard felt as if the ground were opening beneath his feet. I didn't know, he managed to say. No, you didn't, William said bitterly. Because you didn't care to know. You just saw an elderly lady and decided she didn't deserve respect, that she didn't belong in first class. Well, my mother has more class in her little finger than you'll ever have in your whole life. William, please. Margaret stood up, touching her son's arm. Anger doesn't solve anything. How can you defend him after what he did? I'm not defending. I'm just choosing not to carry anger. Life is too short for that. William still looked at Richard angrily, but he respected his mother's request and stayed quiet. Richard looked at Margaret. Really looked. He saw the wrinkles that told stories of years lived. He saw the hands that trembled not from weakness, but from decades of hard work. He saw the eyes that had witnessed pain and loss, but still held kindness. And he saw, for the first time, the person he had humiliated. I'm sorry, he said, and to his surprise, tears began to burn his eyes. I'm truly sorry. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Are you sorry because you got caught? Or are you sorry because you understand what you did wrong? The question hit him like a punch. Richard wanted to say he understood, but the words died in his throat because he wasn't sure. Did he really understand? Or was he just scared of the consequences? I don't know, he admitted finally, his voice breaking. I just know that. My life just fell apart. I lost everything. The investors are gone. My company is going under, all because because you treated another person as if they were less than you. William finished bitterly. Richard nodded, unable to deny it. Margaret sighed and sat back down. She gestured to the chair beside her. Sit, she said. Mom. William began to protest. William, let us talk. Please. Reluctantly, William stepped away a few paces, but kept his eyes on Richard, watching. Richard slowly sat down in the chair next to Margaret. They stayed silent for a moment, the noise of the airport around them, flight announcements, people talking, children running. Why did you do that? Margaret finally asked, her voice soft. Why did you think you had the right to treat me that way? Richard didn't answer immediately. He thought about the question, really thought. Because I always believed that's how the world works, he said slowly. That people who have more money, more success, deserve more respect. That they have the right to demand what's theirs. And I didn't deserve respect because I looked plain? Because I was aging? The words were like knives, but Margaret said them without anger, only with deep sadness. Yes, Richard admitted, shame burning on his face. And I was wrong, completely wrong. Why were you wrong? Because respect isn't something you buy. It's not something you earn by having money or power. It's basic. Every person deserves respect simply for being a person. Margaret nodded slowly. Are you saying this because you believe it, or because you lost everything and now realize you need to change? It was a cruel question, but fair. Richard thought honestly about it. A bit of both, he admitted. But sitting here now, knowing what you've done, who you are, makes me realize how blind I was, how much I lost sight of what really matters. And what really matters? Richard looked at William standing nearby, protecting his mother. He looked at how Margaret held that old photo, the memory of her young son. He looked at the kindness in her eyes despite everything he had done. People, he said, connections, love, leaving the world a little better than you found it. Not just accumulating money and power. Margaret stayed quiet for a long time. Then she spoke. My husband, Captain Robert, used to say something. He said that flying a plane is the easiest thing in the world if you have the right attitude. But if your attitude is wrong, even the simplest flight becomes impossible. Life is like that too. Your attitude was wrong for a long time, Mr. Bennett, and because of that you crashed. But the question now is, will you stay crashed? Or will you learn to fly again, this time with the right attitude? Richard felt something break inside him. All the defenses, all the pride, all the arrogance he had built over the years, everything crumbled, and he cried. There in the middle of the busy airport he cried, not just for the lost deal or the bankrupt company, but for all the wasted years being someone he now saw so clearly was despicable, for all the people he had stepped on, for all the times he could have been kind but chose to be cruel. Margaret didn't touch him, didn't comfort him, just sat there, letting him feel the full weight of what he had done, of what he had become. When Richard finally composed himself, wiping tears with the back of his hands, he looked at Margaret. How do I fix this? He asked. How do I become a better person? You don't fix it, Margaret said. Not overnight. Real change takes time. It takes effort. It takes humility to admit your mistakes and courage to do differently. Where do I start? Margaret thought for a moment. Start with the people you hurt. Start by making peace. And then, when you've done that, look for ways to help instead of just taking. Donate your time, your energy, your skills to something bigger than yourself. Richard nodded. It was scary, the idea of changing so much. But it was also freeing, in a way. Like a weight he didn't even know he was carrying had been lifted from his shoulders. I'll do it, he said. I don't know how yet, but I will. Margaret smiled at him for the first time. I believe you, she said simply. Those words, coming from the woman he had humiliated just hours before, were more than Richard deserved. He felt it deeply. Thank you, he said, for giving me a chance. For not simply hating me. Hate is a poison we drink hoping the other person will die, Margaret said. I learned long ago not to carry it. William approached again, still wary but a little less hostile. Mom, it's time. Your flight is delayed. Margaret stood up slowly. Richard stood up too. Where are you going? He asked. Back home, Cleveland. I just came for the day to see William. He had a short break and I... Wait, Richard said suddenly. That seat. Seat 2A. Was it really yours? Margaret hesitated, then nodded. It was. My son, she indicated William, always books first class for me when I come visit him. He insists, even though I tell him it's not necessary. He says it's the only way I'll accept the tickets he pays for. Richard closed his eyes. So he had actually taken her seat. There was no system error, no confusion. She was in the right place, and he, with his premium card and inflated ego, had simply assumed she was wrong. I'm sorry, he said again. I know, Margaret replied, and I accept your apology. She began walking away with William, heading toward the gate. Richard stood there, watching them leave. He wanted to do more, say more, fix more. But he knew this wasn't the moment. Real change took time, as Margaret had said. Richard left the airport and took a taxi to the hotel. In the room he turned his phone back on. Hundreds of messages were waiting. Missed calls, emails, everything he had been avoiding. He started responding one by one, to Michael, apologizing for ruining everything they had built together, to his mother, whom he hadn't spoken to in months, saying he wanted to see her, to clients, admitting his mistake and saying he understood if they wanted to terminate contracts. And then he wrote a public statement. Not because Jennifer had told him to, not because it was strategic, but because it was right. In the statement, he fully admitted what he had done. He didn't try to justify himself. He didn't try to minimize it. He apologized to Margaret publicly and apologized to everyone who had witnessed his deplorable behavior. He promised change and promised action. He posted it on social media and turned off his phone again. He wouldn't sleep much that night. But when he did sleep, it would be knowing he had taken the first step. The following days were difficult. Michael was still angry, justifiably. Clients cancelled contracts. The company, as Michael had predicted, entered an inevitable bankruptcy process. Richard had to fire employees. He had to sell his expensive apartment. He had to let go of many of the things he thought defined him. It was painful. It was humiliating. It was necessary. But in the middle of everything, he did something he had never done before. He started working as a volunteer. He sought out the Aviation Family Support Association that William had mentioned. He offered his business and management skills, asking for nothing in return. At first, people were suspicious. They knew his name, they knew his story. But he persisted. He showed up every week. He did the humble work nobody else wanted to do. He organized paperwork. He helped families fill out complicated forms. He sat with widows who had lost their husbands in accidents, listening to their stories. And slowly, very slowly, he began to change. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of revelation where everything became clear. It was gradual, like the sun rising in the morning. Small changes, small insights, accumulating day after day. He began noticing things he had never noticed before. The weariness on the face of the waiter who served him at the coffee shop, the daily struggle of the cleaning woman who worked 3 jobs to support her children, the untold stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things without recognition. 3 months after that fateful day on the plane, Richard was at the association's headquarters organizing files when Margaret entered. She came once a month to Chicago for board meetings. Richard didn't know she would come that specific day. When she saw him, her face showed surprise. "Mr. Bennett." "Please call me Richard," he said, quickly standing up. I'm a volunteer here. I have been for a few months." Margaret looked around, seeing the work he was doing. She saw the stacks of organized documents, the files carefully labeled. "I didn't know," she said. "I didn't do it so you would know," Richard replied honestly. "I did it because you were right. I needed to change, and this, helping people here, has been changing me." Margaret smiled, that gentle smile he remembered. "I'm proud of you." Those words, simple but sincere, meant more to Richard than any successful business deal or full bank account ever had. "How are you?" Margaret asked. "Better," Richard said. "My company officially went bankrupt last month. I'm living in a small apartment. I work at a consulting firm now, much less prestige, much less money. But I'm better. I'm sleeping at night. I'm talking to my mother every week. I'm finding purpose." "Sometimes we need to lose everything to find what truly matters," Margaret said. "That's what happened to me." They talked for a few more minutes. Margaret had a meeting. Richard had more volunteer work to do. But before she left, Richard spoke. "That video," he said. "The young woman who recorded it. Justice Seeker 89. I managed to track down who she was through social media. I sent a thank you message. Thank you. For showing me who I was, for forcing me to face my actions. It was painful but necessary." Margaret put her hand on his arm. "You learned the most important lesson life can teach," she said. "Humility. Keep it up." She walked away, but stopped at the door and looked back. "Richard, there's a family here, the Thompson family. They lost their father 6 months ago in an accident. They're in serious financial trouble, might lose their home. You have business experience in organizing finances. Maybe you could help them." "Of course," Richard said immediately. "I'll do whatever I can." Margaret nodded and left. Richard spent the following weeks working with the Thompson family. Mrs. Patricia, the widow, was drowning in debt and paperwork she didn't understand. Richard sat with her, patiently explaining every document, every option. He renegotiated debts, found assistance programs she didn't know about, organized her finances so she could keep the house. It wasn't easy. There were nights where he stayed up late studying laws he never needed to know before. There were moments of frustration when doors closed and help was denied. But he persisted, and when they finally managed to save the house, when Mrs. Patricia cried with relief and gratitude, hugging Richard tightly, he felt something he had never felt in any business deal he closed. True satisfaction. Purpose. The months passed. The video was eventually replaced by other scandals, other controversies. People forgot for the most part. Richard Bennett became just another cautionary tale about pride and fall. But for those who worked at the association, for the families he helped, he became something different. He became someone reliable, someone who showed up, someone who cared. On the first anniversary of that flight, Richard was sitting on a park bench near the association, drinking a simple coffee. His phone rang. It was an unknown number, but this time he answered. "Hello? Mr. Bennett, this is Donald Harrison." Richard took a moment to register the name. Donald Harrison, one of the investors who had rejected his proposal a year earlier. "Mr. Harrison, what can I do for you?" "Actually, it's what I can do for you. I've been following your journey this year. Discreetly, I admit. I saw your work at the association. I saw the families you helped, and I have a proposal." Richard listened as Donald explained. He was setting up a consultancy focused on helping small family businesses, especially those in crisis. He wanted someone with business skills, but also with compassion, with an understanding of the human side of things. "It won't be glamorous," Donald admitted. "It won't be very profitable, at least not at first, but it will be meaningful, and I thought you might be interested." Richard didn't hesitate. "I'm interested." They scheduled a meeting. This time Richard arrived on time, without arrogance, without presumption, just as a man trying to make a positive difference in the world. The work with Donald started slowly, but was rewarding in ways Richard never imagined. They helped bakeries on the verge of bankruptcy, small family stores struggling against big chain competition, ordinary people with simple but important dreams, and Richard discovered he was good at it, not because he was smart or aggressive in business, but because he now understood something fundamental. Behind every number, every report, every financial statement, there were people. People with families, with dreams, with fears. 2 years after that flight, Richard was at a ceremony at the association. They were celebrating 2 decades of service, and Margaret was being honored for her dedication and leadership over the years. Richard watched as person after person took the stage to talk about how Margaret had impacted their lives, widows she had comforted, children of deceased pilots she had mentored, entire families she had helped rebuild their lives after tragedy. When Margaret went up to receive her plaque of honor, she looked at the audience and smiled. Her eyes met Richard's in the middle of the crowd, and she nodded slightly. After the ceremony, while people socialized and ate snacks and drank punch, Richard approached Margaret. "Congratulations," he said sincerely. "You deserve every recognition." "Thank you, Richard. I see you brought someone." Richard smiled and waved to a woman standing a little apart, talking with other volunteers. She was simple, a public school teacher, unpretentious. They had met when Richard was helping the school where she worked organize its finances. "Sarah," he said, "she is special." "I can see it in your eyes when you talk about her," Margaret said. "I'm happy for you, Richard." "I wouldn't be who I am today without that day," Richard said. "Without you forcing me to look at myself truthfully. It was the worst and best day of my life." "Life has an interesting way of teaching us what we need to learn," Margaret reflected, "even when the lessons are painful." William approached, now a captain like his father had been, wearing his uniform with pride. He greeted Richard warmly, a dramatic change from their first meeting. "How are you, Richard?" "Well, William. Very well. I heard you're training new pilots now." "Yes, trying to pass on what I've learned, just like my mother does with people." They talked for a few minutes about aviation, about life, about changes. It was surreal for Richard to be there as a friend of the family he had once treated so poorly, but it was real. And he deserved it not for the person he had been, but for the person he was becoming. As the night wore on and people began to leave, Richard found himself alone with Margaret once again. She was tired, he could see. The years were weighing on her as they do on everyone eventually. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I am," she said, "just thinking about how fast time flies. It feels like yesterday that Robert was alive, that the children were small. And now William has children of his own. Time flies faster than any airplane." "Do you have any regrets?" Margaret thought about it. "A few," she admitted. "I wish I'd had more time with Robert. I wish I'd been more patient sometimes with the children when they were little. But overall, no. I've lived a good life. I've helped people. I've loved and been loved. In the end, that's all that matters." Richard absorbed these words. "Thank you," he said suddenly. "For what?" "For giving me a second chance, for believing I could change, for—" "Richard," Margaret gently interrupted him, "I didn't give you a second chance. You gave it to yourself. I just pointed the way. You chose to walk it." Richard nodded, feeling tears prick his eyes again, but these were different from the tears he had shed that day at the airport 2 years ago. Those were tears of shame and despair. These were tears of gratitude and peace. "Still, thank you." Margaret held his hand for a moment, squeezing it gently. "Keep doing good, Richard. Keep helping people. And always remember that day. Not with shame, but as a reminder of who you don't want to be again. Every day," Richard promised. "Richard, every day I remember." They said their goodbyes. Richard watched as William helped Margaret into the car, caring for her with that tenderness only devoted children have. He watched until the car disappeared into the Chicago night. Then he went back inside where Sarah was waiting, and together they helped clean up the hall, stacking chairs and collecting used glasses. Humble work, simple work, but honest and necessary work. And Richard did it with a smile on his face. Because finally, after so many years chasing the wrong thing, he had found what truly mattered. It wasn't money. It wasn't power. It wasn't first-class seats or expensive suits or impressive titles. It was connection. It was purpose. It was making a difference, even if small, in other people's lives. It was being human, completely and humbly human. And that, Richard discovered, was worth more than any deal he could have closed, any fortune he could have amassed. Years later, when Richard was older, with grey strands in his own hair, he still told that story. To eager and ambitious young entrepreneurs, he spoke about the day his life fell apart in seat 2A of an airplane, and about the elderly lady who taught him to fly again, but this time with the right attitude. He never forgot. He never let his renewed success, modest but genuine, go to his head again. He kept the photo someone had taken at Margaret's ceremony, him and her side by side, smiling. He kept it on his desk, a constant reminder. And every time he took a flight, which he still did occasionally for work, he always treated everyone with respect. Flight attendants, cleaning staff, other passengers, everyone. Because he learned in the most painful way possible that every person has a story. Everyone is fighting battles we can't see. And everyone, absolutely everyone, deserves dignity and respect. It was an expensive lesson. It cost him everything he thought mattered, but in the end, it was the best lesson he ever received. And when Richard heard the news about Margaret years later, when William called to say she had passed away peacefully in her sleep at 83, surrounded by family, Richard cried, not just for the loss of someone who had changed his life, but because he knew the world had lost someone truly special, someone who had lived with grace, with kindness, with purpose. He attended the funeral in Cleveland. The church was packed with hundreds of people whose lives Margaret had touched. Richard sat in the back, listening to story after story of her generosity, her wisdom, her compassion. Afterward, at the cemetery, William saw him and came to greet him. "She was very fond of you," William said. "She always said you were one of her best stories. Proof that people can change." "She saved me," Richard said simply. "She saved many of us." They stood there for a moment, two men united by the memory of an extraordinary woman. "I'm going to continue her work," Richard finally said. "At the association helping families, it's the least I can do." She would be honored. Richard returned to Chicago that night, sitting in the economy class of an airplane. He could have bought first class now, his consulting with Donald was going well, but he chose not to, not out of penance, but because he genuinely didn't care about those distinctions anymore. In the seat next to him was a young executive, all dressed in a suit, looking impatiently at his watch, already complaining even before the plane took off. Richard recognized him. Not the specific person, but the type. He had been exactly like that once. "First trip to Chicago?" Richard asked friendly. The young man barely looked at him. "I don't have time to chat. I have important business." Richard smiled sadly. There was so much of his old self there. "I understand," he said. "But can I give you some advice if you want?" "I don't want," the young man replied rudely, putting on headphones. Richard wasn't offended. He simply leaned back in his seat and looked out the window as the plane took off, Chicago disappearing below, becoming a carpet of lights. And he thought of Margaret. He thought of everything she had taught, not with words, but by example. He thought about how a single interaction, a single moment of truth, can change the course of an entire life. The young executive next to him eventually took off his headphones, frustrated with something on his laptop. He sighed loudly, annoyed. Richard decided to try once more. "Problems?" he asked. "Corrupted presentation. Had a backup, but it won't open. I have a meeting in 2 hours and—" "Can I take a look?" Richard offered. "I have experience with this." The young man hesitated, pride battling with desperation. Desperation won. "Okay." Richard worked on the laptop for 15 minutes, recovering the file and fixing the issues. The young man watched, impressed against his will. "How did you learn to do that?" he asked when Richard finished. "Years of experience," Richard said, "and many mistakes along the way." "What do you do?" "Consulting, helping small businesses, nothing too glamorous." "Oh," the young man said, the interest fading. Clearly he was expecting something more impressive. But then, perhaps feeling he owed something, he asked, "That advice you were going to give?" What was it? Richard thought carefully about his words. "Just this. No matter how important your business is, how crucial your meeting is, never use that as an excuse to treat other people poorly. Because in the end, it's people that matter. Not business, not money, people." The young man seemed slightly confused, as if that were too obvious to be real wisdom. "Right," he said. "Thanks for fixing my file." He went back to work, and Richard said nothing more. He had planted the seed. It was up to the young man to decide if it would grow. The rest of the flight passed peacefully. When they landed and people began to disembark, the young executive pushed his way forward, eager to get off first. Richard watched, remembering himself, and just shook his head with a small, sad smile. Some people learn. Others have to fall first, like he did. But he hoped, genuinely hoped, that the young man would find his way before the cost became too high. Richard was the last to leave the plane, as he always was now. He thanked each flight attendant by name, wished them a good day, and as he walked through the airport toward the taxi, his phone rang. It was Sarah, the woman who had become his wife 2 years ago. "Hi, honey," he answered. "I just landed." "How was the funeral?" "Sad, but beautiful. Margaret would have liked it." "Are you okay?" "I am," Richard said honestly. "Sad, but grateful. Grateful to have known her. Grateful for the second chance she helped me give myself." "Come home," Sarah said softly. "I made your favorite dinner, and I have something to tell you." "Something good?" "Very good, but it has to be in person." Richard smiled, feeling warmth spread in his chest. "I'm on my way." He hung up and quickened his pace, but not rudely, not pushing anyone. Just a man eager to return home, to the life he had built, to the person he loved. A life different from the one he had before, smaller in some ways, less money, less prestige, less power, but infinitely greater in what truly matters: love, purpose, peace. And as Richard got into the taxi and the driver asked where to, he gave his address, a modest apartment in an ordinary neighborhood, and he smiled, because he was going home, to his life. A life he had almost completely lost in an airplane seat 2.5 years ago, a life that an elderly lady named Margaret had helped him find again. And for that, for her, for that hard but necessary lesson, Richard would be eternally grateful. Because in the end, the story of Seat 2A wasn't about a man losing everything. It was about a man finding everything that truly matters, and that made all the difference. End of story. So what did you think of this story? Did it touch you in any way? Did Richard manage to learn his lesson in time, or do you think he should have faced more consequences? And Margaret, what an incredible woman, right? Write in the comments what you felt, which part moved you the most, and if you've ever been through a similar situation in your life. Your words are always welcome here. Don't forget to leave your like if the story was worth your time, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories that will touch your heart. Until next time.